My dear friends, before we start, I asked you all to press a like and leave your comment. This will help a lot to promote this video and to release news stories as soon as possible. It's not hard for you, but it's a pleasure for me. Thank you. At 30, I still hadn't found the one. My mother, bless her heart, never missed a chance to remind me. Every family dinner, every phone call. Jacob, when are you going to settle down? Her voice echoed in my head constantly. But what could I tell her? I'd gone months without a single date, and honestly, I was starting to feel like everyone around me was moving on with their lives. Marriages, kids, family vacations. I was the odd one out, the perpetual bachelor. That's when I got desperate and signed up for a speed dating event in Wardale, a quaint little town that had its own charm. The event was being held at a local pub, and I figured I had nothing to lose. As I walked through the doors of the bar, wearing my best suit and splashed with my favorite cologne, I was hit by the sheer number of people. 21 men, 21 women, all sitting around, waiting for their 3 minutes of magic. The host, a cheerful guy with too much gel in his hair, explained the rules. The women would remain seated while the men rotated tables every 3 minutes. The bell would ring when it was time to move. Simple enough, right? I could already feel my nerves kicking in, but I had to remind myself, this was a fresh start. The first few women I met didn't exactly spark joy, to put it mildly. The first was much too young for me, barely out of college. The second seemed a bit too mature. By the time I reached the fifth woman, it was a combination of mismatches. One woman had 5 kids, another kept nervously adjusting her glasses, and one actually sneezed continuously through the conversation. Maybe speed dating wasn't my thing after all. But then, something changed. When I sat down at the final table, there she was, Linda. Long black hair, emerald green eyes, and this warm smile that lit up the dim bar. She wore all black, like she was in mourning, but her presence was the brightest thing in the room. She had this calm energy, and despite everything that had happened earlier in the evening, I found myself feeling relaxed. We hit it off immediately. "Hi, I'm Jacob," I said, leaning in slightly, trying not to sound too desperate. "Linda," she replied, her voice soft but confident. We talked about everything, music, movies, even the strangest foods we'd tried. She had this infectious laugh that made me feel like I had known her forever. It wasn't long before we were diving into more personal topics. Linda told me about her past, how she had once been married and had 2 kids. Both had passed away from a rare illness, and soon after, her husband left her. I didn't know what to say at first. The weight of her story hit me hard, but Linda didn't seem bitter. She was sad, sure, but resilient in a way that drew me closer. Her vulnerability made me feel like I had to protect her. As the evening drew to a close, we exchanged numbers, and to my surprise, she asked to meet again the next night. Weeks turned into months, and Linda and I grew inseparable. Every moment spent together felt right. Her laughter filled the empty spaces in my life, and her presence was like a balm for my loneliness. The people of Wardale knew her well, and while she seemed to have few close friends, they all admired her strength and perseverance. About 7 months in, I knew she was the one. It was the right time, and I had no doubts. I proposed to her on a rainy evening under the canopy of trees in Wardale Park, the very place where we had shared our first kiss. She said yes, and for the first time in years, I felt like everything was falling into place. After our wedding, I moved into her house, a charming but old Victorian on the edge of Wardale. It had that rustic, lived-in feel, with creaky floors and antique furniture. My favorite part was the cozy fireplace in the living room, where we'd spend countless nights curled up, talking about our future. But there was one place in the house that felt off, the basement. It was always locked, and Linda had 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't go down there. "Too damp," she'd say. "Nothing interesting down there, just old junk." And I believed her. Until I didn't. One Sunday afternoon, Linda told me she needed to grab some groceries for dinner. She kissed me goodbye, and as she left, I found myself staring at the basement door again. The curiosity was eating me alive. Why was it always locked? Why was she so insistent that I stay out? With Linda gone, I made my move. I rummaged around the house until I found the key, hidden in the back of a drawer in the kitchen. Heart pounding, I unlocked the door and was immediately hit by a wave of musty air. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended into the dimly lit space. The basement was everything Linda said it was: old, damp, and filled with dust-covered boxes. But something wasn't right. There was a stench in the air, something foul that clung to the walls. I followed it to the far corner of the room, where I found a stack of old VHS tapes. Next to them was a worn-out VCR. Curiosity got the better of me. I carried the tapes upstairs and plugged the VCR into the TV. The first tape I inserted was fuzzy at first, but then the screen cleared. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The video showed a dimly lit room, one that looked eerily similar to Linda's basement. In the center of the room was a figure tied to a chair. A second figure stood over them, wearing a dark hooded robe, their face obscured. As I watched, the hooded figure began to move slowly, almost deliberately. They raised their hand, and that's when I realized they were holding an axe. My stomach turned. I couldn't watch anymore. I ejected the tape, my hand shaking. What the hell was this? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Just then, I heard the front door creak open. "Jacob?" Linda called from the hallway. I froze. She couldn't know what I had just seen. In a panic, I shoved the tape back into the box and hid everything under the couch. When she walked in, she seemed the Jacoby, calm, collected, loving. But something in her eyes was different. Darker. "I thought I told you not to go into the basement," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just reading by the fire." Linda's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since I met her, I felt a deep, unsettling fear. She knew. She had to know. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the video replayed in my mind over and over. Who was the person tied to the chair? And why did Linda have those tapes? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to confront Linda. I needed answers. "Linda, we need to talk," I said, sitting her down at the kitchen table. My voice was firm, but inside I was trembling. She looked at me, her face calm but distant. "About what?" I took a deep breath. "About the basement. About those tapes." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Linda's expression shifted. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm, inviting smile I had fallen in love with. It was cold, calculated. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered. My heart pounded in my chest. "What? What is this, Linda? Who was that in the video?" Her eyes darkened, and she stood up, pacing the room slowly. "Jacob, you don't understand. There are things in this world that you can never unsee. And now you've seen too much." At that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. Linda wasn't who I thought she was, and the woman I had married, the one I had promised to spend the rest of my life with, had secrets far darker than I could have ever imagined. "Jacob, there's no turning back now," Linda said, her voice low, almost a growl. "You belong to me." That night, I left Wardale for good. I packed a small bag, took my car, and drove until the town disappeared in my rearview mirror. I didn't look back. How could I? I never saw Linda again, but her shadow still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear her laugh. A laugh that once brought me joy but now only fills me with dread. I don't know if I'll ever escape her. Maybe I never will. Months passed after I left Wardale, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda was still watching me. Every night, in the quiet of my apartment, her presence lingered in the shadows, an invisible weight pressing down on me. I had nightmares, vivid, suffocating dreams where her cold smile hovered above me, whispering that I belonged to her. Waking up in a cold sweat became routine. I moved to a new town, far away from Wardale. A place with no memories of her, no traces of the life we'd shared. I rented a small, nondescript apartment in Ravensford, trying to piece my life back together. I got a new job at a local hardware store, where I could lose myself in mindless tasks, helping customers find the right tools for their home projects. It was a quiet life, just what I needed. But Linda was always there, in the corner of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't remove. And no matter how far I ran, the shadows of Wardale followed. One evening, while I was stocking shelves at work, I got a call from an unknown number. My hand froze mid-reach. My heart raced, and I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. I hadn't given my new number to anyone except a few close friends. Could it be her? I answered, my voice barely steady. Hello? Jacob, a familiar voice whispered on the other end. It was Louis, my childhood friend. Relief washed over me for a split second before I realized something was off. Louis sounded strange, distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. Louis, is that you? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. I saw her, Jacob. She's here. She's coming for you. My blood ran cold. Louis lived miles away, nowhere near Wardale, nowhere near Linda. But the terror in his voice was unmistakable. What do you mean? Where are you? There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing heavily, like he was trying to hold back tears. I'm at the old bridge, near the edge of town. Come quick, Jacob. Please. I don't have much time. The line went dead. I stood there, paralyzed, the phone still pressed to my ear long after the call ended. Louis had always been the rational one, the guy who kept his cool in any situation. But something had rattled him to his core. And he had mentioned the bridge, the one by the outskirts of Ravensford, where no one went anymore. Without thinking, I grabbed my Louisette, told my boss I needed to leave, and jumped into my car. As I sped through the dark streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a trap. But Louis needed me. I couldn't leave him alone. When I reached the old bridge, it was well past dusk, and the air was thick with fog. The bridge loomed ahead, a rusted relic from the town's past. I parked the car and got out, calling for Louis. Louis! Where are you? No response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees and the occasional creak of the old structure as it swayed under its own weight. My breath fogged in front of me as I scanned the area. Nothing. And then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes to my left. I turned, heart pounding, and saw a shadowy figure emerge from the fog. It was Louis, but he didn't look right. His face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with fear, and his clothes were torn. He staggered toward me, clutching his side. Jacob, you shouldn't have come. I rushed toward him, grabbing his arm to steady him. Louis, what the hell happened? What did you see? He shook his head, his breathing labored. It's Linda. She's not who you think she is. She's something else. I saw her in Wardale. I tried to get away, but she found me. She always finds you. His words sent a shiver down my spine. Louis, what are you talking about? Linda's not here. She can't be. But deep down, I knew he was right. Linda had always been more than she appeared. There was something dark, something otherworldly about her. And now, whatever she was coming for me. Suddenly, Louis's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back into his head. He let out a strangled gasp, and I watched in horror as a deep, unnatural voice escaped his lips, a voice that wasn't his. You can't escape me, Jacob. You're mine. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Louis collapsed to the ground, convulsing as if some unseen force had taken hold of him. I wanted to help him, but I was frozen with terror. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the convulsion stopped, and Louis lay still, his chest rising and falling slowly. I rushed to his side, shaking him. Louis! Louis, wake up! His eyes fluttered open, but there was no recognition in them. He looked past me, his gaze distant, as if he were staring at something far away. She's here, he whispered, barely audible. A cold wind swept across the bridge, and in the distance, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing closer with every passing second. I turned, my heart in my throat, and saw her. Linda. She stood at the far end of the bridge, shrouded in fog, her black dress billowing in the wind. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the warm, inviting woman I once knew was gone. In her place was something cold, something ancient, something hungry. Jacob, she called, her voice echoing unnaturally through the night. You can't run from me. You belong to me. You always have. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, pulling Louis to his feet. We have to go. Now. We stumbled toward the car, But with every step, I could feel Linda closing in. Her presence was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. The air grew thick, and it felt like I was wading through water just to move. As we reached the car, I shoved Lewis into the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. Linda was right behind the car, her face inches from the glass, her eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. She smiled. "You can't escape." The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as we sped down the road, but even as we drove, I could feel her. She was still with us, her presence clinging to the car like a shadow we couldn't shake. Back at my apartment, I locked every door and window, my mind racing. Lewis was slumped on the couch, his face pale and drawn, still recovering from whatever had taken hold of him. "We have to leave," I said, pacing the room. "We have to get as far away from here as possible." Lewis shook his head weakly. "It won't matter, Jacob. She'll find us. She always finds you." I stopped, staring at him. "What do you mean? How do you know?" Lewis's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time, I saw the depth of his fear. "Because I've seen it before. She's not the first. There's something in Wardale, something that's been there for centuries. It takes people, makes them. Like her. And once it has you, it never lets go." The weight of his words sank in, and a cold dread settled in my chest. This wasn't just about Linda. It was bigger than her, bigger than me. And I had no idea how to stop it. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every rustle of the wind outside, sent me into a spiral of paranoia. Lewis slept fitfully on the couch, his face twisted in fear even in his dreams. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I woke, the apartment was silent. Too silent. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lewis?" No answer. I got up, stumbling through the darkened apartment, searching for him. But he was gone. The front door was wide open, the cold night air spilling into the room. Panic surged through me as I ran outside, calling his name. But there was no sign of him. The streets were empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. And then I saw it, just a flicker of movement at the end of the street. A shadow, darting between the buildings. It was him. I chased after him, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I couldn't let him go. Not like this. As I turned the corner, I saw Lewis standing in the middle of the street, staring at something in the distance. I followed his gaze, and my heart sank. There she was. Linda. She stood at the edge of the darkness, her eyes locked onto Lewis, her hand outstretched toward him. "Lewis, don't," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't move. He just stood there, frozen in place, as if her presence had taken hold of him once more. And then, slowly, he took a step toward her. "No!" I screamed, running toward him. But it was too late. Linda's cold, twisted smile spread across her face as Lewis disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the darkness. I fell to my knees, my breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. He was gone. And in that moment, I knew that Linda would never stop. She would come for me next. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the shadows of Wardale would always find me. I don't remember how long I stayed there, on my knees in the middle of the empty street, the icy air biting into my skin as the reality of what just happened sank in. Lewis was gone. Just like that. Taken by Linda, if that's even what she was anymore. The emptiness swallowed me whole. For a moment, the world around me blurred, like I wasn't even there. All I could think about was Lewis's last expression, how his face was blank, hollow, as if the Lewis I knew had been stripped away in an instant. His soul, his life, gone. But then something flickered deep inside me, a faint, stubborn spark of survival. Lewis was gone, but I wasn't. Not yet. And as long as I was still breathing, I couldn't let Linda have me too. I forced myself to stand, the world tilting slightly beneath my feet. My legs trembled, but I made my way back to my apartment, my mind racing. I had to leave. Ravensford wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe if Linda could follow me here. So where would I go? And how could I run from something that wasn't entirely human? Something that could seep into your life without warning and pull you into its shadow? The sound of footsteps behind me broke through my thoughts. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, half expecting to see Linda or some other figure from the darkness. But it wasn't her. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and familiar. I squinted through the dim streetlights and recognized him. Dan, a guy I had met once or twice around town. He worked at a mechanic shop nearby and had always seemed friendly, though we never exchanged more than small talk. He was walking toward me, his face creased with concern. "Jacob?" he called, his voice low but clear in the still night. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I couldn't tell him the truth. No one would believe it. How could I explain that my best friend had just been taken by a shadowy figure that might not even be human? Yeah. I'm fine," I mumbled, shoving my hands in my pockets to hide the way they trembled. "Just long night." Dan didn't look convinced. He glanced over his shoulder, as if sensing that something was wrong, and stepped closer. "You sure? I was on my way home and thought I saw you running down the street like you were being chased by something." I forced a smile. "Nah, just jogging. Needed some air." Dan frowned, studying me for a moment before he shrugged. "All right, if you say so. But listen, if you ever need help with anything, I'm around. Night's getting colder though. Better get inside." He gave me a small wave and walked off into the fog, leaving me standing alone once again. I turned back toward my apartment, the chill creeping deeper into my bones. I couldn't let anyone else get pulled into this nightmare. I didn't want anyone else to end up like Lewis. Back in the safety of my apartment, I locked the door behind me and slumped against it, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over me. My mind was a mess of fear and grief. Lewis's voice echoed in my head, telling me about Wardale, about the entity that had been there for centuries, taking people and turning them into... what? Beings like Linda? Shadows of their former selves, haunting the world and spreading their darkness? I don't know how or why it had chosen me, but it was clear that I was its next target. And running wasn't going to save me. Not this time. I had to fight back. I had to stop Linda before she came for me. But how? I remembered the way Lewis had described Wardale, like it was a place of secrets, a place where the normal rules of the world didn't apply. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answers I needed were probably back there. Back in Wardale, where it had all begun. The next day, I took a leave of absence from work, packed a small bag, and made the long drive back to Wardale. The road seemed darker than I remembered, even though it was daytime. The trees that lined the road were like silent sentinels, watching me as I drove closer to the place I had hoped to leave behind forever. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows over the landscape. I parked the car at the edge of town, right where the forest began. This was where I had last seen Linda, the real Linda, before everything had gone wrong. Stepping out of the car, I could feel the air shift around me, as if the entire town was holding its breath. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. I walked toward the woods, my steps slow and deliberate, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end with every movement. Wardale was more than just a town. It was alive, in a way. Its history was seeped into the ground, into the trees, into the very air. And now, whatever was here wanted me back. As I ventured deeper into the forest, memories of my time with Linda surfaced. Good memories. The walks we'd taken together, the late-night talks, the warmth she used to radiate. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. The Linda I had loved was gone, replaced by something far darker. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The light dimmed, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. And then I saw it, the Black Bridge, an ancient, decaying structure that spanned a narrow gorge at the edge of the forest. It had been here for centuries, forgotten by the outside world, and now it was crumbling, barely holding itself together. I walked toward it cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I needed answers. As I stepped onto the bridge, I heard it, Linda's voice. Soft at first, almost a whisper, carried on the wind. Jacob, you came back. My blood froze, but I didn't stop. I had to face her, had to confront whatever she had become. I came back for answers, Linda. I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. What are you? Why are you doing this? There was a long silence, and then, slowly, Linda appeared at the far end of the bridge. She was just as I remembered her, black dress, cold smile, but there was something different now, something more terrifying. Her eyes weren't human anymore. They glowed with an unnatural light, and her skin seemed to ripple with shadows, like something was moving just beneath the surface. You already know the answer, Jacob, she said, her voice echoing through the trees. I am what this place made me. And now it's your turn. I took a step back, my heart pounding. What do you mean? Linda smiled, and in that moment, I saw the darkness that had consumed her, the ancient, malevolent force that had turned her into this creature. This town, this forest. It's alive, Jacob. It's always been alive. And it takes what it wants. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, grabbing onto the rusted railing of the bridge. I could feel the darkness rising, closing in around me. The air was thick with it, suffocating. And then, in the distance, I heard it, a faint, familiar sound. A voice. Stephanie. She had been my neighbor before I moved away from Ravensford. We hadn't spoken much, but she had always been kind. I had no idea why she would be here, in Wardale, of all places. But her voice was unmistakable, and it called out to me from somewhere beyond the bridge. Jacob, don't listen to her. It's not too late. I hesitated, torn between the two voices, the familiar warmth of Stephanie's plea and the cold, seductive pull of Linda's presence.